My name is Mary Wabuikanyi, a PhD Research Fellow from the University of Nairobi Women's Economic Empowerment Hub. In this video, we are going to focus on Professor Patricia Mbote. Kindly introduce yourself.
My name is Patricia Mbote. I currently serve as a professor of law at the School of Law, University of Nairobi. I am a mother of 2 grown children. I am a wife as well, and I was born in Mugoiri in Murang'a County. I had my early education in Murang'a County, but moved to Kirinyaga, actually Kerugoya, for upper primary school, from whence I left and went to Loreto Limuru, again Kiambu County, and was in Loreto Limuru for 6 years, from 1977 to 1982. And after that, I went to the youth service. We were among the very first group of pre-university recruits. Served in the youth service and joined just before we joined the university in 1984. Joined university in 1984, the faculty of law, and graduated in 1987. Went to the School of Law, became an advocate of the High Court, went to Warwick for my master's soon after that, completed and came back and began teaching in January 1990. And so I began teaching here in 1990. Later went for my PhD in Stanford, but before that I studied women's law at the University of Zimbabwe between 1994 and 1995. Then went to Stanford between late 1995 and 1999 and got my doctorate there, specializing in property and environment.
Professor Mbote, what was your role in constitution-making process in Kenya?
It's very difficult to say when one became involved in the constitution review process, because as soon as I started teaching, I realized that the laws I had been taught and that I was now teaching were very much against women. Actually, I realized the gendered nature of our laws when I became employed, and I had to deal with whether I was entitled to house allowance, whether I was entitled to annual leave after I had maternity leave. And so you begin to question the laws. And in questioning the laws, then you realize that the Constitution was ambivalent on the whole question of gender discrimination, because it allowed for discrimination on personal law matters, which are marriage, succession, and devolution of property upon death. And I think I began writing about the gendered nature of law very early, and also because there were not many women teaching law. We were, I think, two or three of us. And the questioning of law then leads you to question the Constitution. So when discussions about Constitution review came, we were really ready to get into it and to support it with all that we had. But in terms of formal engagement, when the commission was formed, I was involved in supporting them through research. And even when the drafts were generated, I reviewed them. I was involved in talking to different women's groups when there were threats to divide the women's movement. And I remember vividly at Bomas when the whole question of women under Islam almost divided the women's movement. And I actually went and talked to the women, of course, with other people, but just trying to make them see that we'd come so far. But before that, there was a lot of arguments about should gender really be in the Constitution. And I remember for me that was like an examination, because with Professor Maria Nzomo and Professor Jacqueline Oduor, we were called by the commissioners to make the case, really, for gender in the Constitution. And at the Commission's offices, we were really confronted with a very hostile group. But thankfully, there were people like the late Okoth Ogendo, who decided that there was need for a conference at Safari Park to just make the case for women in the Constitution. And so I was tasked to make the case for including women in the Constitution from a legal point of view, Professor Nzomo from the political point of view, and Professor Oduor from the social cultural point of view. And basically that then became the rallying call that we needed to say, why should gender be in the Constitution? Why should women be in the Constitution? Because, when you say gender, there would be the issue of masking the differences between men and women. But when you say women, then you are really pointed on the fact that there had been no women when our earlier constitutions had been made, and now we were recreating our social contract, and women had actually negotiated a space at the table because we had women commissioners, and it was really good to have the women commissioners in there, but also for them to know that they could count on us who are not at the commission to backstop them with any research and information they needed.
Kindly elaborate on your engagement with the women's organizations in the constitution-making process in Kenya.
The original woman, the one that really raised my consciousness beyond law, was the African Women on Research and Development, AWOD. When I joined the University of Nairobi, there was a very vibrant group of women researchers. And I remember there was Professor Wanjiku Kabira, there was Professor Maria Nzomo, there was Professor Shanyisa Hasiani, and they were meeting and discussing how to keep this group together. And I think serendipitously, I got involved because I was asked to do a constitution for AWOD. And we spent long periods of time just discussing how should that constitution be. And I believe that it is in those engagements that the sisterhood with older women was forged. And that enabled me to have friends among older women who had been in the struggle, and I was enlisted into the struggle. There was also the National Council of Women of Kenya. And the National Council of Women of Kenya was housed somewhere near here, behind the police station. And what we saw, of course, Wangari Maathai, were the seedlings that were littered around the floor of the National Council of Women of Kenya office. But there was actually a very political and group formation narrative, even within those tree seedlings, etc. So, for instance, I remember there was the rallying call that if people are putting up men as candidates for elections, in 1992, I remember vividly at KICC, Kenyatta International Conference Center, the rallying call of women, why can't we have Wangari Maathai as our candidate? So NCWK, AWOD, and then of course FIDA. When FIDA was formed, people like Lillian Mwaura in her office in Ajib House on Harambee Avenue, actually Haile Selassie calling us in there and conscientizing us to what we needed to do for women. So those are some of the groups that I was involved in at those early stages.
Which strategies do you think worked best to enable the women to achieve their gains in the constitution-making process in Kenya?
women were everywhere. And I think if you think about women's role in constitution making, and maybe I'm using an example that may not be apt, think about putting leaven in dough when you're cooking. You put it in there and it affects each and every part so that it all rises. Women were in every space of constitution making. And I think the networking, getting different women to talk to each other, and not having barriers that because you're in the academy, you won't have answers for us who are in the grassroots. Just naming women's problems as women named them, and realizing that each woman's problem needed to be dealt with. So you shouldn't invisibilize or invalidate the concerns that whatever woman raised when you spoke to her. In the constitution making process, I think that just having women in the constitution, at the table, and then knowing that if they needed anything at any time, they could call on we women to avail it.
Which are some of the challenges that women encountered during the constitution making process in Kenya?
Infiltration of women's groups by people who wanted to divide the movement, and creating schisms between women based on, say, party lines, based on ideologies, sometimes even based on tribe. And those really, even religion, when you come in and say, you as women of a particular religion, why are you supporting this position when it is not really supported by a religion? So just the fact that women find themselves belonging to different republics. And because women really are not the heads of those republics, at least not formally, so they could actually be called on and told and rallied by people who felt that they had actually deviated from the common of what their republic was.
You have talked about infiltration. Can you elaborate, please?
When a big women's group becomes part of a political party that was very patriarchal, then you see a group that was formed to propagate and push women's positions was co-opted totally. And I think the story of maendeleo ya wanawake is not a secret. So if you look at the time that maendeleo then became a wing of the ruling party KANU, then the question was, how could they be going against the ruling party, which was the only party at that point anyway? So in terms of survival, for that group, they needed to be within the mainstream. And in being in the mainstream, it meant that the women's agenda had actually been put on the back burner.
How does the Constitution give impetus to women's economic empowerment in Kenya?
When we looked at the Constitution draft, and I was involved in the 2005 referendum push. You remember the first draft, which they called the Wako draft. And, looking at the Wako draft, of course, there were things there, like when they were talking about Christian courts, which we had never heard about, and we knew they could turn out to be like our traditional courts. But we were so scared as women that, sometimes you're looking a bird in hand, two in the bush. In fact, with Dr. Nkatha Kabira, we have a paper we wrote on separating the baby from the bath water. And that was actually informed by the discussions that were happening in 2005. So 2005 referendum happens, the draft is tossed out. I was privileged to have been appointed amongst the Committee of Eminent Persons by President Kibaki to advise the government on the way forward with the constitution review process. And actually, I mean, when I look back now, our proposals were taken because we had given a raft of recommendations, a multi-sectoral forum, etc. But a committee of experts was one of the things that we suggested, and that committee of experts is what was tasked to complete the process. I followed the draft, and I remember vividly a group of parliamentarians going to Naivasha and mutilating the draft that had been generated by the committee of experts and actually removing the National Land Commission that I was very involved in working towards through the National Land Policy. When the draft eventually came for referendum in 2010, it was not, it was not like 100% perfect, but from a woman's perspective, we got a lot. We felt like, the way you take a child to a store with many sweets, and they really don't know what to choose because everything, absolutely everything that women had asked for, they got. One was that whole issue of moving away from gender discrimination. The Constitution was unequivocal on equality of men and women. And equality of men and women, not just tokenly, but they also talked about in economic, political, and social realms. So that, in my view, enabled women, even where there would be masked or structural or systemic discrimination, to actually say, you're going against the Bill of Rights, because that is Article 27 of the Bill of Rights. Then it didn't stop there, because there are women who, over the years, had really got the short end of the stick. Women who, after marriages broke up, were actually left with nothing. And so in the chapter on land, chapter 5, there is actually very clear protection of women's rights to property and to the matrimonial home specifically. And then there were the others who, when their spouses died, the widows, who are disinherited. We'd done lots of research, very sad stories of women. After the man died, people would come in some parts of this country. They mourned carrying the beds, carrying the chairs, and the Constitution was very clear about the protection of the rights of widows and even their children. So those at the very, first of all, that if a woman can't even have a home, how can you talk about economic empowerment? But beyond that is the protection of socioeconomic rights, the right to food, the right to water, right to education, right to health. And I think when you're looking at economic empowerment, you have to look at the enabling factors. Because if you just look at, if we just say, oh, you have a right to a livelihood, that in and of itself doesn't mean much. You must look at the situation of the woman that you're concerned about, and then look at what is it that she needs to actually have a livelihood. So for the woman in Kibra, in an informal settlement, her economic empowerment and livelihood is not going to be like the woman in Nyakach. Because the woman in Nyakach probably already has land that she's stealing. Granted, she may not have full power to determine what happens on the land. She is on some territory. The woman in Kibra maybe wakes up every morning to determine what will it take to have a meal on the table today. But both of them are linked by the importance that the right to dignity, whatever you do and however you treat women, assuring them of dignity is going to be important in the quest for economic empowerment. Yeah.
What are some of the lessons you learned in the constitution-making process in Kenya and that we can adopt in promoting women's economic empowerment?
I think today it's a lot easier because there are many spaces where policies are being made. The fact that they have stakeholder engagement, public participation, which didn't happen then. You can actually access the powerful at the local levels because of devolution, which was not the case in this time. But I think the point remains solidarity, sisterhood, and leveraging networks.